Lieutenant Jake Morrison had grown accustomed to the subtle vibrations that hummed through the compound's walls whenever a Zephyrian shuttle touched down. The antimatter engines produced a frequency that seemed to tickle his molars, and after 6 months of guard duty, he could identify which type of vessel was landing without even looking at his scanner. This particular rumble belonged to a diplomatic courier, probably carrying more of those impossibly complex treaty amendments that made his head spin just thinking about them. He adjusted his position against the cargo bay's reinforced doorframe and glanced at his chronometer. Another 4 hours until shift change, another 4 hours of watching absolutely nothing happen while the real action occurred 3 levels up in the diplomatic wing. The irony wasn't lost on him that he possessed security clearance high enough to know the Zephyrian Queen's favorite breakfast beverage but wasn't trusted to stand within 50 meters of her daughter. "Morrison, you still breathing down there?" crackled through his comm unit. "Unfortunately, yes," Jake replied, tapping the device clipped to his collar. "Though I'm starting to think the cargo containers might be more interesting conversationalists than me at this point." Sergeant Riley's laugh echoed with digital distortion. "At least cargo doesn't file complaints about your terrible jokes." "Hey, my jokes aren't terrible. They're just aggressively mediocre." The comm fell silent, leaving Jake alone with the soft hum of environmental processors and the occasional click of settling metal. He tried reading to pass the time, but the Zephyrian technology interfered with most electronic devices in unpredictable ways. His tablet had started displaying text in what appeared to be ancient Sanskrit last week, and tech support was still scratching their heads over that one. A soft thud from the direction of his quarters made him straighten. The sound repeated, followed by what might have been a very quiet curse in a language his universal translator couldn't parse. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm as he pushed away from the doorframe. His quarters were exactly as he'd left them that morning, spectacularly messy, with uniforms draped over every available surface and a collection of coffee cups that had achieved sentience sometime last Tuesday. What hadn't been there 12 hours ago was the young woman curled up on his narrow bunk, dark hair spilling across his pillow like liquid shadow. Jake's brain performed several complicated logical gymnastics before arriving at the conclusion that he was either hallucinating, dreaming, or about to become the central figure in the most awkward diplomatic incident since his grandfather accidentally proposed to an alien princess 50 years ago. The woman's breathing was deep and even, suggesting she was genuinely asleep rather than playing some elaborate game of political intrigue. She appeared entirely human except for the delicately pointed ears that rose from her hair like elegant question marks. Even in sleep, she possessed an otherworldly grace that made the cramped military quarters look like a palace chamber. Jake recognized her immediately, of course. Every guard in the compound had been shown her image during their initial briefing, along with strict instructions about maintaining respectful distance and never, under any circumstances, allowing her to end up unconscious in their beds. Well, Jake whispered to himself, this is either going to be the shortest court-martial in military history or the most interesting Tuesday I've had in months. He considered his options with the methodical precision of someone whose career had just taken a sharp left turn into uncharted territory. Wake her up and risk startling a princess who possessed psychic abilities he didn't fully understand. Leave her sleeping and try to explain to his superiors why he hadn't immediately reported a massive security breach. Or find some middle ground that wouldn't result in either intergalactic war or his immediate demotion to cleaning waste recyclers on the lunar mining station. Princess Lyra shifted slightly, murmuring something in Zephyrian that sounded like poetry mixed with mathematical equations. Her face, relaxed in sleep, looked younger than her 23 years and bore none of the carefully controlled expression she maintained during public appearances. Whatever had driven her to seek out his quarters, it hadn't been part of any official diplomatic protocol. Jake quietly retrieved a spare blanket from his locker and draped it over her sleeping form. The gesture felt simultaneously protective and completely inadequate, like offering an umbrella during a solar storm. He settled into his desk chair, which creaked in protest against his weight, and resigned himself to the longest night of his life. Outside, another shuttle arrived with its familiar antimatter hum, probably carrying more officials who would have very strong opinions about the current situation if they knew about it. Jake checked his sidearm, ensured his comm unit was set to silent, and began the delicate process of not panicking while a member of alien royalty used his pillow. "Just another Tuesday in paradise," he murmured, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing and wondering how exactly he was going to explain this to anyone without sounding completely insane. Jake woke to the sound of someone rummaging through his emergency rations with the enthusiasm of an archaeologist discovering lost treasure. He'd fallen asleep in his chair sometime around 0300 hours, after spending most of the night alternating between staring at his unexpected guest and mentally composing resignation letters that began with, "Dear Command, regarding the princess in my bed. I hope you don't mind," Princess Lyra said without turning around, her voice carrying the melodic quality that made every Zephyrian sound like they were perpetually on the verge of breaking into song. "But your food storage system is fascinating. How do you keep everything from deteriorating without stasis fields?" Jake rubbed his eyes, wondering if this was still part of some elaborate dream. "We call them preservatives. Chemical additives that slow down decomposition. Not exactly cutting-edge technology." She held up a protein bar like it was a precious artifact. "Brilliant in its simplicity. Our nutrition cubes require quantum stabilization matrices just to remain edible." She paused, examining the wrapper more closely. "Although I'm not entirely certain what natural artificial flavor means. Is it naturally artificial, or artificially natural?" "That," Jake said, stretching the kinks out of his neck, "is one of humanity's greatest philosophical mysteries. Right up there with why we park in driveways and drive on parkways." Lyra's laugh was like crystalline bells being struck by tiny hammers made of pure starlight. The sound seemed to resonate at frequencies that shouldn't have been possible within the normal range of human hearing, creating harmonics that made Jake's coffee mug vibrate slightly on his desk. "I should probably ask," Jake continued, pulling himself upright and trying to look like he hadn't just spent 8 hours sleeping in a chair while committing what was likely 17 different violations of military protocol, "how exactly you ended up in my quarters last night. Not that I'm complaining about the company, but security might have some pointed questions about our overnight arrangements." Lyra's expression shifted from amused to troubled, and she set down the protein bar with careful precision. "I've been having episodes. Blackouts where I lose time and find myself in places I don't remember going to. The royal physicians claim it's stress from the negotiations, but..." She gestured vaguely at the cramped quarters around them. "This doesn't feel random." "You mean you've done this before?" "Not exactly like this." She moved to his window, peering out at the compound's inner courtyard where maintenance crews were performing their morning checks on the atmospheric processors. "I usually end up in meditation chambers or quiet corners of the library. Places that feel safe. But last night, I was discussing trade agreements with Commander THYSS, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up here." Jake considered this information while his brain performed rapid calculations about how much trouble he was potentially in. "And you have no idea why your unconscious mind decided my room qualified as safe?" "None whatsoever." Lyra turned back to him, and Jake noticed her eyes held flecks of silver that seemed to shift and swirl like liquid metal. "Although I should mention that you have an unusually calming psychic signature. Most humans radiate emotional noise like background static, but you're more like..." She paused, searching for the right analogy. "Like a quiet lake on a windless day." That's either the nicest compliment I've ever received or a polite way of saying my personality is boring. Definitely the former. She smiled, and Jake felt something warm unfurl in his chest that had nothing to do with the room's environmental controls. "Though I confess I'm curious about why you're stationed so far from the diplomatic wing. Your service record suggests you should be on the inner security detail." Jake nearly choked on the sip of coffee he'd just taken. "You've seen my service record? Royal prerogative. I like to know about the people protecting us." Lyra settled onto the edge of his bunk, somehow managing to make the standard issue furniture look elegant. "But the files don't explain why Commander THYSS specifically requested your assignment to the outer perimeter. Something about you being unsuitable for proximity to the royal family. Join the club of people who don't understand that decision." Jake set down his coffee mug with perhaps more force than necessary. I've been trying to figure out what I did wrong for 6 months. Clean record, exemplary evaluations, no diplomatic incidents in my past. Unless you count the time I accidentally called Ambassador Vex's ceremonial headdress festive, but that was supposed to be a compliment. Lyra's giggle transformed into full laughter, and this time the harmonics made several items on Jake's desk rearrange themselves into neat geometric patterns without anyone touching them. She noticed his startled expression and quickly composed herself. Sorry. Strong emotions sometimes trigger minor telekinetic responses. It's perfectly normal for Zephyrians, but I know it can be unsettling for humans. Are you kidding? That's the coolest thing I've seen since I watched your mother's ship phase through a solid asteroid during the approach sequence. Jake gestured at his newly organized desk supplies. Though I have to say, if you could teach me that trick, my quarterly efficiency reports would look a lot better. I could try, but human minds aren't naturally configured for telekinetic manipulation. You'd probably just give yourself a headache and accidentally launch your coffee mug into orbit. Wouldn't be the first time I've weaponized my incompetence. 3 days passed without incident, which in Jake's experience meant the universe was simply winding up for something spectacular. He'd managed to file his duty reports without mentioning unauthorized royal visitors, though he suspected his increased coffee consumption might raise eyebrows in the medical department. The soft chime of his door's override sequence interrupted his evening routine of pretending to read while actually wondering if he'd imagined the entire encounter. Lyra stepped through the entry portal carrying what appeared to be a crystalline flower that pulsed with soft blue light. I brought a universal translator, she announced, holding up the device. The standard ones they issue for diplomatic functions are terrible for casual conversation. This one actually captures humor and sarcasm, which I suspect will be essential for our discussions. Jake set down his tablet, grateful for an excuse to stop pretending he understood quantum mechanics. I'm flattered you think I'm capable of sarcasm, Your Highness. Though I should probably mention that harboring runaway royalty isn't exactly in my job description. I prefer to think of it as diplomatic outreach. Lyra activated the translator, and Jake felt a subtle tingling sensation as it established neural links with both their minds. And please, just call me Lyra. Formal titles make me feel like I'm about to deliver a speech about trade tariffs. The device worked remarkably well. When Lyra spoke, Jake could hear not just her words but the emotional undertones and cultural context that normally got lost in translation. More surprisingly, he could sense her genuine relief at being somewhere she could speak freely. So, Jake said, settling into his desk chair while Lyra claimed her usual spot on his bunk, rough day in paradise. Commander THYSS spent 4 hours explaining why humans shouldn't be allowed to establish colonies in the Centauri system because you have an alarming tendency to name things after food. Lyra rubbed her temples with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to diplomatic headaches. Apparently, calling a moon cheese will 7 is considered culturally insensitive. In our defense, it really does look like cheese. And we were hungry when we found it. That's exactly what he said you'd say. Lyra's smile carried a hint of mischief that made Jake wonder if she'd been defending humanity's questionable naming conventions. I may have mentioned that Zephyrians name star systems after mathematical concepts, which is why we have a perfectly functional solar system called optimal recursive function prime. Jake laughed, and the sound seemed to relax some tension he hadn't noticed building in Lyra's shoulders. I'm starting to understand why you need somewhere to decompress. How do you handle the pressure of constantly being on for diplomatic functions? Meditation, mostly. And reading human literature, which my tutors consider a questionable hobby. Lyra pulled her legs up under her, settling into the cramped space with practiced efficiency. Your storytelling tradition is fascinatingly chaotic. Zephyrian narratives follow precise structural algorithms, but human stories just wander wherever they want to go. Like life, basically. Exactly. She paused, and Jake caught a flicker of something deeper through their translator link. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to just wander wherever I wanted to go. No protocols, no security details, no predetermined outcomes. Jake recognized the tone because he'd used it himself countless times while staring out at the stars from whatever military outpost he'd been assigned to. Being stuck in a role you never chose is a special kind of prison, isn't it? The understanding that passed between them felt almost tangible, enhanced by the translator's emotional resonance capabilities. For a moment, the cramped quarters seemed less like a military billet and more like a sanctuary where two people could acknowledge the weight they carried without having to pretend it was lighter than it was. "Tell me about growing up on mining stations," Lyra said suddenly. "Your file mentions you lived on asteroid colonies until you were 16, but the details are classified." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Not much to classify, really. My father worked the deep extraction rigs, pulling rare minerals out of rocks that had been floating in space since before Earth had oceans. Dangerous work, but it paid well enough to keep us fed and educated." "And your mother?" "Died when I was 8. Reactor malfunction on the station where she worked." Jake's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone he'd developed over years of explaining this to people who didn't know how to respond. "Dad always said the best way to honor her memory was to find humor in the darkest situations. Laughing at the void means you're still alive to laugh," he used to say. Through the translator, Jake could feel Lyra's empathy as a warm presence, free from the awkward pity he usually encountered when sharing this story. She understood loss in her own way, the isolation of responsibility and expectation. "Is that why you make jokes about everything?" she asked gently. "Partially. Also because the alternative is taking myself too seriously, and nobody needs that kind of punishment." Jake grinned, deliberately lightening the mood. "Plus, humor is one of humanity's most effective defense mechanisms. We joke about death, taxes, and the possibility that the universe is fundamentally absurd because the alternatives involve too much crying." As if summoned by their conversation's serious turn, several small objects around the room began drifting gently upward. Lyra noticed Jake's fascination and gestured apologetically as the items settled back into place. "Emotional resonance triggers telekinetic responses," she explained. "It's involuntary when I'm relaxed. Most Zephyrians learn to suppress it in mixed company, but this doesn't feel like mixed company." "No," she said softly. "It feels like home." Lyra arrived at Jake's quarters the following evening with the determined expression of someone who'd spent considerable time accessing files she probably shouldn't have been reading. The crystalline translator device pulsed more rapidly than usual, suggesting elevated stress levels that Jake had learned to recognize over their brief but intensifying friendship. "I know why they won't let you near my family," she announced without preamble, settling cross-legged on his bunk while Jake nearly dropped his dinner ration. "That sounds like the beginning of either a really good story or a really bad one," Jake said, setting down his fork and giving her his full attention. "Please tell me it doesn't involve my grandfather accidentally starting another interstellar war." Lyra's expression shifted to something between sympathy and barely contained amusement. "Actually, it involves your grandfather accidentally proposing to my mother." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the atmospheric processors cycling 3 decks away. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and finally managed to produce something that might charitably be called speech. He did what now? The Morrison incident. Lyra activated a holographic display that materialized above the translator device, showing what appeared to be official diplomatic records. 50 years ago, during first contact protocols. Your grandfather, Commander William Morrison, was part of the initial human delegation to Zephyr Prime. Jake stared at the rotating documents, recognizing his family name in several languages he couldn't read. He never mentioned proposing to anyone. Especially not alien royalty. It was a misunderstanding about cultural greeting customs. When my mother, who was Princess Nerix at the time, offered him the traditional Zephyrian welcome gesture, he reciprocated with what he thought was an appropriate human response. Lyra paused, clearly trying not to smile. Unfortunately, the combination of his gesture and her gesture together formed a binding proposal ritual that's been sacred on Zephyr Prime for approximately 3,000 years. Oh no. Oh yes. According to these records, it took 6 months of intensive diplomatic negotiation to explain that humans don't actually propose marriage by touching someone's elbow while making that particular facial expression. Jake buried his face in his hands, suddenly understanding why his grandfather had always changed the subject whenever anyone asked about his military service. Please tell me it gets better. Well, no one started shooting, so technically it was resolved peacefully. But Zephyrian officials decided that the Morrison bloodline carried what they diplomatically termed unpredictable diplomatic variables. Lyra gestured at the floating documents, which reorganized themselves to highlight a particularly damning passage. The recommendation was that future Morrisons should be kept at safe distances from important Zephyrian ceremonies, negotiations, or family members. The absurdity of the situation hit Jake like a plasma bolt to the cerebral cortex. He started laughing, a sound that began as a chuckle and escalated into full-blown hysterics that made the translator device emit concerned chirping noises. My career has been shaped by inherited cosmic awkwardness, he gasped between fits of laughter. I've been blacklisted by an entire civilization because my grandfather accidentally engaged himself to your mother 50 years before I was even born. Lyra's own composure cracked, and she began giggling with the musical quality that Jake had learned to associate with genuine amusement rather than diplomatic politeness. The sound triggered her telekinetic abilities, causing his spare uniforms to arrange themselves in neat piles while his collection of coffee mugs performed a synchronized orbital dance around the room. It gets worse, she managed between giggles that were now affecting the room's environmental controls. Commander THSS was there. He was my mother's junior aide at the time, and he's never forgotten the incident. He specifically requested your assignment to the outer perimeter to prevent any possibility of Morrison-related diplomatic complications. Of course he was there. Of course. Jake wiped tears from his eyes as the implication sank in. So not only am I paying for my grandfather's mistakes, but I'm being supervised by someone who has a 50-year grudge against my family's tendency to accidentally propose to people. In fairness, it's not a grudge. More like extreme caution based on empirical evidence. Lyra had regained enough control to stop the flying coffee mugs, though Jake's desk supplies continued to rearrange themselves according to some alien organizational principle. Though I should mention there's another complication. Jake's laughter died as he recognized the shift in her tone. What kind of complication? The episodes I've been having, where I lose time and end up places. They're not medical. Lyra's voice carried a new gravity that made the translator device pulse with deeper colors. They're psychic manifestations. My consciousness is forming bonds with locations and people that provide emotional stability. The room seemed to grow quieter as Jake processed this information. And my quarters provide emotional stability? You provide emotional stability. She looked directly at him, and Jake could feel something shift in the space between them, like gravity realigning itself around a new center of mass. The bond is forming whether we intended it or not. Every time I come here, every conversation we share, it grows stronger. Jake sat back in his chair, understanding beginning to dawn like a particularly unwelcome sunrise. Let me guess. Psychic bonds between humans and Zephyrians are probably covered by some ancient law that makes everything infinitely more complicated. Sacred bonds are considered inviolable under traditional Zephyrian law. But politically, Lyra's gesture encompassed the implications without needing to spell them out. A psychic connection between the royal heir and a human whose grandfather once accidentally proposed to the queen would be seen as either cosmically ironic or deliberately provocative. Wonderful. So we're dealing with space politics, inherited diplomatic disasters, and psychic bonds that apparently have legal standing. Jake rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache that would probably require advanced alien medicine to cure. Is there any chance this situation could get more complicated? As if in response to his question, his communication device chimed with an incoming priority message from Commander THYSS, requesting Jake's immediate presence in the diplomatic wing. Commander THYSS had the look of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for approximately 50 years and wasn't pleased about finally having it. He stood behind his desk in the diplomatic wing's main conference room, flanked by holographic displays showing treaty documents that seemed to multiply every time Jake blinked. Lieutenant Morrison, THYSS began, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated bureaucratic frustration. Perhaps you can explain why Princess Lyra has been visiting your quarters with increasing frequency over the past week. Jake had prepared several responses during his walk through the compound's corridors, ranging from complete honesty to creative fiction. What came out of his mouth was neither. Would you believe she's helping me organize my sock drawer? Lyra, seated at the conference table with her mother Queen Nerix and several other Zephyrian officials, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh or possibly a diplomatic cough. The Queen herself maintained the serene expression that had made her legendary in interstellar negotiations, though Jake caught a flicker of something that might have been amusement in her silver eyes. Lieutenant, THYSS continued with the patience of someone explaining orbital mechanics to a particularly slow asteroid. Psychic bonds between species are detectable through quantum resonance scanning. We've been monitoring the situation since it began manifesting. Ah. Jake felt his carefully prepared explanations crumble like a stale protein bar. So you know about the whole bonding thing? We know about the bonding thing, Queen Nerix confirmed, speaking for the first time since Jake had entered the room. Her voice carried the same musical quality as her daughter's, but with harmonics that suggested centuries of experience in handling impossible situations. The question is what we're going to do about it. THYSS activated another holographic display showing what appeared to be legal documents written in languages that hurt Jake's eyes to look at. Sacred bonds, once formed, are legally binding under traditional Zephyrian law. However, the political implications of such a bond between the royal heir and a human are problematic. Especially a Morrison, added one of the other officials, whose name tag identified him as Ambassador Krell but whose expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. Jake glanced at Lyra, who was studying the holographic documents with the intensity of someone planning either a brilliant legal strategy or spectacular rebellion. Through their psychic connection, he could feel her determination like a warm current beneath his conscious thoughts. What kind of options are we talking about here? Jake asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like any of the answers. Option 1, THYSS said, highlighting a section of the legal display, you accept a substantial financial settlement and permanent relocation to a colony world outside Zephyrian space. The bond will weaken over time and distance. Option 2, Queen Nerix continued seamlessly, you undergo consciousness modification to sever the psychic connection while remaining on Earth. The procedure is relatively safe, though it does involve selective memory alteration. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as the implications became clear. Both options meant losing Lyra, losing the connection that had become the most meaningful part of his existence over the past week. Through their bond, he could sense her own distress at the proposed solutions. And option 3, he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. Lyra stood from her chair with the fluid grace that made even simple movements look choreographed. Option 3 is that we invoke the right of sacred declaration. The silence that followed was so profound that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. Commander THYSS looked like someone had just suggested using antimatter for fireworks, while Queen Nerix's expression shifted to something between maternal pride and diplomatic horror. Lyra, the Queen said gently, the right of sacred declaration hasn't been invoked in over 2 centuries. Because no one's been brave enough to use it, Lyra replied, moving to stand beside Jake with the confidence of someone who'd spent hours researching ancient legal precedents. But the law is still valid. A psychically bonded pair has the right to petition for joint sanctuary under the protection of both governments. Jake blinked. That's a thing. It's a thing, Lyra confirmed, though her smile carried a hint of the same reckless determination that had apparently run in his family for generations. We publicly acknowledge our bond during tomorrow's treaty signing ceremony, forcing both Earth and Zephyr Prime to honor the ancient protocols. Or, Commander THYSS interjected with the tone of someone who'd seen too many diplomatic disasters, you create an interstellar incident that makes your grandfather's proposal look like a minor social awkwardness. Actually, Queen Nerix said slowly, her expression thoughtful, it might work. The right of sacred declaration supersedes standard diplomatic protocols. If they invoke it publicly, both governments would be legally bound to recognize and protect the bond. Jake looked around the room, taking in the faces of officials who were either calculating political ramifications or wondering if they could claim this meeting never happened. Through his connection with Lyra, he could feel her hope and determination, but also her willingness to accept whatever choice he made. "So let me get this straight," he said finally. "We can either spend the rest of our lives apart and miserable, or we can potentially cause a diplomatic crisis that might change interstellar law forever." "That's a remarkably accurate summary," Ambassador Krell confirmed with the resigned tone of someone whose career had just taken an unexpected detour through uncharted space. Jake thought about his grandfather, who'd accidentally proposed to an alien princess and somehow lived to tell the tale. He thought about his father's advice about laughing at the void because it meant you were still alive. And he thought about Lyra, who'd found her way to his quarters through psychic instinct and chose to trust him with her vulnerability. "Well," he said, taking Lyra's hand and feeling the psychic bond strengthen like a completed circuit, "if causing cosmic-scale awkwardness really does run in my family, I guess we might as well do it properly." Queen Narek smiled, an expression that transformed her face from regal composure to maternal warmth. William Morrison would be proud. Though he'd probably also want to hide under a rock until the media attention died down. Tomorrow would bring treaty ceremonies, formal declarations, and probably several varieties of organized chaos. But tonight, Jake Morrison stood in a room full of diplomatic officials, holding hands with an alien princess who'd chosen him despite every logical reason not to, and realized that sometimes the most ridiculous solutions really were the only ones that worked. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all.